Patreon topics are always interesting because they give me an insight into what my Patreons, especially, are taking from, to an extent, my videos, but also other things they're looking at and reading, and other things they're interested in. If I just lower that down a bit. It's better. That's better. When this topic came in from BlackburnMaximus, that's the Patreon name, I looked at it and went, I've been talking about this a lot over the years. I have many ideas. This will be easy. Hubris. Hubris hits us all. I've recorded the long patrol for this video a couple of times. I'm not sure which one will actually go live on Saturday the 21st, but one of them will. This is the one I'm recording actually before the live. Now, why has this topic always interested me? Because the fall of France, believe it or not, is massive. It's massive. But, in terms of strategic consequences for the progress of the war, whilst if France fails to fall, probably the war ends very quickly. Rather self-explanatory. If the German army somehow gets routed in France and annihilated in France or taken mostly prisoner, then very quickly the British and French forces would go the other direction across the border into Germany, and well, that would all be over rather quickly. Barring that, though, barring that point of discussion, barring that point of consideration, very quickly when you start to look through World War II, there is potentially no other country quite so important as Norway. It's not her large military. It's not even her very, very innovative and very, very committed population. It's certainly not her highly interesting government, which I would say is one of the most domestically astute while internationally ignorant, or rather internationally willfully ignorant governments I have ever had the joy of studying. I mean, there was very nearly a section in this video about the Norwegian proposals for peace plan, even after they've had a failed invasion from the Germans, for a European peace. And I thought, the trouble is that all sounds too believable, and also at a certain point there is going to be someone who's going to be a conspiracy, who's going to come back to me and go, well, you know, this shows that the Allies let Norway fall so that there wouldn't be a peace treaty. And I would be starting an entirely new conspiracy theory. So I deleted those slides. Okay, deleted them. I'm not starting off that conspiracy theory. I seem to start off enough. I've started off an entire religion over a very ugly aircraft from World War II, from the 1920s and 30s. And actually, one of them was still flying around in World War II, believe it, one side. I managed to start off that without intending to it. There is no way I am starting off an entire new conspiracy theory about Norway and a peace plan that would have happened if they had not fallen to Germany. There are many things I'm prepared to start. That wasn't one of them. But mostly, the importance of Norway is geography. And the fact that its position will cause Germany more trouble than anything else. In fact, the interesting thing is, for Germany, getting Norway and France is what makes them as viable. If they only get one, not the other, they lose. Then their war effort is completely snookered. If they get France, and in this scenario, I am not presuming that France somehow manages to, I don't know, not somehow invest rapidly in decent radios for their own forces, and actually wake up and trust their military enough to actually allow them to operate effectively in order to defend themselves. That is, well, for honesty's sake, for that to work, it would require a lot of alcohol to be distributed, and probably a lot of targeted assassinations. Just going to say that. Okay, to get France into anywhere, in any way, any kind of shape or form of actually being able to defend itself viably in 1940 would require a humongous effort to change history. And please never ask me to do that video, because I'd basically be going through providing a hit list for 1930s French politicians. That's just not something I'm keen on doing. But, shameless book plug, and of course there is a lot about the Norway campaign in this book, because of course the tribal class got involved, Altmark incident, Narvik, Namsos, all sorts of places the entire way through the Norway campaign, and of course Operation Claymore and several other operations afterwards involving commandos. Basically, the tribals have a lot of fun with Norway. But, principally, as I said, it's geography. It's where Norway is that's going to affect the war effort. And it's also its neighbours, because there are advantages. There are solid advantages to the access Norway gives you if Norway is not taken over by the Germans. So what is our scenario for victory? Well, if the German troops never land, versus if they do land, becomes the first point. Because if they don't land, then the Norwegian government may well try to stay neutral. This is the beginning of the Norwegian peace plan. Although adopting a policy similar to Sweden's of muscular neutrality, at a certain point they'd have to. They'd have to arm themselves, because the Germans were coming to invade them. They can pretend they weren't. They can pretend it was just the Germans had a load of troops who just were on their ships, which then got sunk by the Royal Navy. It would be an interesting scenario. There's still, in that scenario, things get interesting. But if they land and actually kill Norwegians, then, in the nicest way, Norwegian government cannot, at that point... Well, they could try, but I honestly think there would be enough people in Parliament, etc., who would be sufficiently annoyed with them that if they then tried to go, well, we should pursue a course of peace. They invaded us. Yes, but we do not wish for war. They invaded us. There is no sticking your head in the sand at this point. I think they'd run into trouble. Yeah, as I said, not going to affect France. But the neutral one intrigued me, because let's say they're not invaded, but let's say they do go neutral. Now, there's the peace plan, etc., and those things, but I wanted to give you some detail. I didn't want to completely destroy that entire idea. The thing is, if the British have destroyed the German invasion fleet, and how's that going to change World War II? Well, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, if the British Royal Navy destroys the German invasion fleet, then they lose all the destroyers which would have been lost at Altmark. They lose probably a lot of cruisers, and they probably lose Scharnhorst and Gneisenau as well. Or at least, if any of those vessels survive, enough of them are severely damaged. That they are no use for the German Navy. You will be repairing them forever, because you're never going to get resources. It's a good way to wipe out the German surface forces at the beginning of World War II. Because the cruisers and the other things which all lost, and would be lost in that sort of battle, will have a permanent ongoing impact. And that is going to be something you also have to consider, because it's not just the fact of Norway being neutral, it's the failure, or the consequences of the failure of the invasion. And how it fails. Now, at this point, if Norway is a muscular neutral, and Germany pretty much has no viable surface threats for 1940, the remainder of 1940, because let's be honest, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are gone. Bismarck, well, Bismarck does, but she's not really worked up and ready for operations till May 1941. And that's kind of useful for the British, and also she'd be the only one there. There'd be no Scharnhorst and Gneisenau may come out, it might be multiple threats, when are they going to be available, they're gone. And so the Germans might well want to wait until Tirpitz is ready for her to go out, which would buy the British even more time to maintain vessels and improve vessels and work on refit them, etc. Now, furthermore, I expand this a bit, the bases at Scapa Flow, at Rosyth, etc., will be out of reach of German bombers most of the time. They'll be out of reach of a lot of German aircraft because they won't be able to base from Norway, and Germany won't have those submarine bases. Britain will be able to access Swedish iron ore via Narvik. They will be able to access it. And if Norway is on a muscular neutral approach of, you were going to invade us, we know, but you didn't actually land, so we can justify pretending you weren't, but by the way, any subs of yours turn up in our waters, they're getting sunk approach, things could be interesting. There's also the fact of getting the submarines up there in the first place. We'll get into that later, but that could be interesting. Now, the big point becomes the Germans' ability to get into the North Atlantic, because they're not able to use the Norwegian ports. They're not able to hug the Norwegian coast at this point. They have to go out and go straight up the North Sea, and that is not a good position for them. They're not going to have the air support, they're not going to have the vessels to support them, and especially, again, they will have lost a load of destroyers, a load of torpedo boats, a load of cruisers in losing Norway. So you have no escort to get those ships really out of the North Sea. This is going to make the life easier for the Royal Navy, dramatically easier for the Royal Navy. They're going to have their aircraft patrolling backwards and forwards. But again, you have advantages going on, because let's say your aircraft crash in Norway. That's terrible. That's a neutral country. Those parts will technically have to be interred. But if they crash in Norway, and you regularly have British merchant vessels going into Narvik to pick up supplies, all they have to do is get to Narvik and get to a ship, and they can get to Britain. So, what do you make sure all your air crew that are operating on North Sea Patrol have? that have the range and can be doing maritime patrol backwards and forwards? Well, they have the means to burn their aircraft, of course, if they have to make a difficult landing somewhere. They also have the cash for them and the directions of how to get to Narvik. Either get a local boat to take them up there, or find some sort of railway line. Honestly, that would probably require crisscrossing into Sweden, because having looked at the railway lines going to Narvik, it's actually easier to get to Narvik by going up the railway through Sweden than it is by trying to get through Norway. But these things will all have an impact. And it makes it a lot easier for the British anti-submarine patrols. Which means German submarines, the ones going out through the North Sea, are going to have to spend a lot more of the time underwater. That's going to reduce their range, because they are a lot slower underwater than they are above water. Especially as, when you think about it, people go, well, they developed the snorkel. That's a lot later in the war. They do not have the snorkel in 1939, 1940, 1941. They don't have it available then, and definitely not in the numbers they need it. So suddenly, the GI-UK gap becomes, for want of a better phrase, the Scotland-Norway gap. This is going to have an effect on the Atlantic convoys, their routing, their organisation. It's also going to have an effect on the ability of the Royal Navy to protect those convoys. Because if the Germans' range is shorter in terms of their range, you might not have such a thing as the air gap. Because if they're not able to operate out from Norway, and passing through the channel for a submarine is still going to be very difficult. Okay, you could get through there. You could hug the coast of Europe and go down to the coast of France and operate from France. That is true. But if you're thinking about it, if you're operating up from France, that's still going to affect your range. It's going to affect your operations. You're not going to be able to operate as far into the North Atlantic, as far up in the North Atlantic as you can from Norway. And again, you have to consider how you're going to support those forces in France, and you're going to have to build all those bases in France, and those facilities are going to be in prime bombing targets while they're under construction. They were historically, but historically there were also Norwegian ones and other threats to deal with. You're not going to have the spread out of threats for the British, especially in the early parts of World War II, to think about. It's just not going to be the case. So, what does this mean for the iron ore, though, specifically? Because I mentioned it a couple of times. What does it mean for the iron ore? Well, it turns the debate of Swedish iron ore into a kind of blockade, where the requirement, the need, is to bid the most. Because they're a neutral power, they'll export to whoever pays the most money. Now, you can argue that it's in their favour to supply to the British, because the Germans have just tried and failed to invade the Norwegians, and the Germans might try and invade Sweden, but, for the iron ore, whereas the British to invade Sweden for the iron ore would have to get past Germany and Norway. So who's it better for Sweden to sell iron ore to? And Swedish iron ore is very, very good. I've got some stats here which I got from a work by Rolf Karlblom. Now, I'm going to read this out. Effect on ore. Well, it would have been profound. The German supply of iron ore, if we consider that between 1933 and 1943, the Swedish supplied 43% of the iron ore used, as opposed to 28.2% produced domestically, 12.9% from France, and a remainder from other sources, including British Empire. More importantly, Swedish ore is of much higher quality and purity than that available from domestic or French sources, meaning much as it is still as today, was priced for armament and armament manufacture. Now, a few years ago back, there was a huge furor in Britain because for certain elements of our warships, we weren't using British steel, we were using Swedish steel. Why? Because the Swedish, with their plants and their iron ore extraction, all the facilities there, have kept up a very high grade of some very specific types of steel, which were no longer being produced in Britain. Because you don't need that much for even a many tens of thousands of tons of warship construction. There's not that much of this really high grade specialist steel involved. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'm talking about something in the 2010s, not something in the 1940s. Well, it's much the same back in that period. If you want to do something really high tech, if you wanted to produce the finest barrels, the finest armor, you want the finest quality ore. Now, Britain has access to many sources of ore. It can import it from around the world. It will happily take and use the ore from Sweden coming across from Narvik. They will happily take that and buy as much of it as they can get. Especially if by buying it, that means that the Germans don't. And for the Germans, this would represent a problem, because it would mean they were in a financial competition with the British. And the Swedes, well, they don't accept IOUs. They require cash. I have no doubt the Germans would be trying. I also have no doubt that powers that be, who are, and other nations, might well seek to assist the British in making sure that they always had enough money to win the bidding for the iron ore. After all, the best battles and the best victories are those secured without ever having to fight. And if the German industry is suddenly losing roughly 40% of its supply of iron ore, as much as 70% of its high-grade supply of iron ore, that's going to have an impact on their ability to build stuff. Now, what will the British do with all this iron ore? Well, I'm very glad you asked. The British will plough it into production of stuff. Because you're buying it, you might as well use it. So, expect some of the units which weren't completed historically to actually be completed earlier. Why? Because there's going to be a lot more iron and steel, iron ore, a lot more steel of various types running around Britain, because there's going to be a huge amount of iron ore going around. A humongous amount. And because of other factors, because even a neutral Norway means that certain parts of Britain will become beyond the range of German, well, I wouldn't say the entirety of the Luftwaffe, because they do have some very interesting aircraft which do have very long range, but the vast majority of the German bomber forces do not have the range to reach all of Britain without the assistance of territory in Norway. So, if the invasion fails but lands, how does the invasion fail? Well, for it to work, the idea I came up with was for the forces that were aiming for Bergen, Trondheim and Narvik to run into the home fleet, which organised around the forces roughly available at that time, which would be Rodney, Valiant, Renown, Repulse, 6 cruisers, 1 French cruiser, 32 Royal Navy destroyers, including roughly 8 tribal class, and 2 French destroyers. Honestly, when I looked at that force and thought, if the German fleet run into that, it's not going to be a pretty fight. It got worse once I remember the exact numbers of those particular groups, what was heading there. You're talking Scharnhorst and Eisenhower, 7 cruisers and 14 destroyers. So yeah, they have equal numbers of cruisers, but you have Renown, Repulse, Valiant and Rodney. So I'm fairly sure they're going to tip the scales some way. But you also have 14 destroyers versus 34, of which 8 are tribal class destroyers, which are, as I've discussed in my book and various other points, are destroyers designed to kill other destroyers. If a destroyer is a torpedo boat destroyer, a tribal class is a destroyer. They are the DD. Now, the thing I thought then would sort of counter it, and this is what I was trying to put through with the results and trying to do some testing and some various systems I tried to work through to run simulations. The moment I accurately, historically programmed in the likelihood of torpedoes working, the U-boats might as well not have been there. Now, interestingly enough, this scenario also means that Glorious doesn't get lost. So the Royal Navy has another carrier wandering around. It's all helpful. It's all helpful and it all adds up. There will be losses sustained by the British. So far, the Allies tend to lose one of the cruisers severely damaged, one sunk, and a couple of destroyers damaged or sunk. Again, it's because the German policy would be to try and run away, especially for Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. The realistic scenario, though, is because they are so laden with troops and personnel, and because of the states of the seas, those forces can't run as well as the RN's destroyers and cruisers can, which mean their overwhelming numbers damage, either slow down or destroy the German lighter forces. Those that are damaged are quickly swallowed up by Valiant and Rodney, coming along going, hello, we would like to introduce you to 15-inch and 16-inch guns. It's as simple as that. The interesting scenario to get into was what happens to Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Well, the most successful point for them came when I programmed a scenario, and please do feel free to run this. There are various World War II skins you can put over Harpoon. Even in Steam, I found that are actually available for people to use, let alone the one which I use, which a friend of mine kindly created for me. And what I found was that if Renown and Repulse follow British doctrine time, they start hunting down those ships. Now remember, historically, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau run from Renown. Renown backed up by Repulse. Okay, they have the more aggressive admiral in charge, but that's actually a problem for him. Because under any scenario where you have this happening, Warspite is not as far away as you might like it to be. And if Renown and Repulse close from the stern and are fighting, and he decides to try and fight them, then Warspite will come up and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau get caught between Renown, Repulse and Warspite. In pretty much every time I ran that, the Germans lost at least one ship. I don't think there was a single time they escaped with both. And I ran it about a dozen times. Those are not free ships they want to get caught by. They are literally two of the ships which can actually catch them, and one ship which, even in computer terms, seems to have some weird magic protecting it. I'm not sure what. It's Warspite. More often than not, they actually lost both. But I'm being nice. I'm saying they lose only one. Okay? So pretty much from their own fleet, they've got away, and I'm going to say they escape with Scharnhorst. Scharnhorst gets away. I'm being nice. Now, the difference from history at this point is the land war, because with Norway not being taken over, but being sufficiently invaded that they are in trouble, what happens is that whilst the Norwegian government are trying to put various people in charge and trying to do things, the British actually just get in contact with Felicia and go, do you want to come south? And they get him to come south. And because he is a major general, they don't want to land a more senior general because they're not planning on taking charge. They want it to be a Norwegian-led operation. So the most senior major general they have wandering around at that point is Major General Carsten de Witt. At which point, I thought a Major General Carl Gustav Felicia and a Major General Carsten de Witt combination combined with their troops, and I honestly didn't see a scenario where if they're well supported and that the Germans have only landed this much force, the initial forces, and haven't really managed to follow up and have lost all their naval forces, so basically the Royal Navy is able to cut off the rest. Yeah, there isn't anything happening there which is good for them. If you have Felicia and de Witt hunting you down, you are going to lose, and it's going to be nasty. Neither understands the concept of giving in. Neither really understands the concept of, of giving up either. So, yeah. That's just not good. That's not good at all. And that leads us to the war in Scandinavia. So again, we're back to the iron ore, but we're back to other things going on. Under this scenario, Norway is no longer neutral. Norway is actively in the war. Norway has been invaded. Norway has been hurt. Her civilians, her cities have been attacked. The Germans have landed tanks. At this point, you now have Norway actively assisting the British in acquiring as much iron ore from Sweden as physically possible. There's being positively pro-British neutral, and there is being, here, we will help you. This makes things even worse. Even worse for the Germans, because you've invaded, and you've lost the invasion. Now, that's also going to upset the Swedes. It's one thing if you've won the invasion, they have to deal with that new reality. You're now on their border. But you've lost the invasion. You're not on their border. You invaded their neighbour, who they have decent, if not always the closest, relationship with, but they're it's kind of like siblings in Scandinavian countries. They will fight viciously with each other, but they don't like anyone else fighting their sibling. That's the combination. It's kind of like Britain and France. We're allowed to beat them up. No one else is. That's our job. You don't get the option to beat up the French. That's us. That's what we do. So, this is the world you're dealing with now for Germany. Weakened iron ore supplies, Britain having access to Norway to resupply its forces, and more likely having more increased access to the Swedish research weapons development facilities. Point. The starting point for the Bofors was the pom-pom, and the Swedish decided they could make it better. The British stuck with the pom-pom because that had a higher rate of fire and could carry a far bigger clip versus the Bofors. Imagine if you have far more ability to liaise with the Swedish developers of the Bofors. You can go and meet them. You can send engineers to go see them. Necessarily, they can fly straight there and fly straight back. If you can do all that, imagine the conversations you can have, and imagine how things can evolve. We could be talking by 1941, the next generation of pom-pom comes in, which has the same range and hitting power as the Bofors, but has the rate of fire and the magazine capacity of the pom-pom. After all, necessity is the mother of all invention, but in this scenario, what we'd be talking about is opportunity, allowing necessity to go have fun. For Germany's perspective, the loss of iron ore supplies. Well, losing access to Narvik is annoying, but as you can see if you look at this graph and various other points, Narvik was always a difficult one to get the actual material out of. Certain times of year it becomes very critical. Basically, most of the supplies that flow out of Narvik traditionally happens in the winter months, when the Baltic can ice up and become very difficult to transit. And so that's when the bulk of the goods actually flow through that. But still, to get it to Germany, you had to bring it down on the Norwegian coast. And Royal Navy submarines considered that a very good targeting area, so did motor torpedo boats. The thing was, there are a whole series of islands and various things off the Norwegian coast, which mean you pretty much have a channel for quite a lot of the way down the coast to make your path through as a merchant vessel. You've lost that completely. You've no longer got that supply route. You've got reduced supplies coming out, if anything, coming out from Sweden. Because whilst they'll probably be neutral, they probably will sell enough that they can still claim their neutrality. As said, the British will be doing their level best to outbid the Germans. And the British will also be attractive to the Swedish because, especially at this point, Germany has tried to invade a neighbour and failed. They now think, well, hang on, who's our biggest threat? Germany or the Soviet Union? Well, the Soviet Union is the other side of Finland at this precise time. And yeah, we have Norway next to us fighting the war. The British aren't likely to invade through them, because why do the British need to invade when they're getting this? When they're getting it? Why do they need to come and attack the farm when they're getting the milk? They don't. But if the Germans haven't got the iron ore supplies coming in, the Germans have suddenly got to start being far more careful about what they build. And remember, this is the time period when it's not Speer running the German armaments industry. It is still the one, the only, Hermann Göring. Never the smartest or most able minister in that particular country. So then we're left with the rest of the war out, because what I'm doing is I'm sort of slowly growing the consequences from Scandinavia. Scandinavia's at war. Scandinavia will be being bombed, okay? Please note that. That's part of the fact. So that's going to divide some of the German effort for the Blitz, because they're going to focus some north. But that's also going to divide some of the British fighters, because Britain will probably have to send some fighters to assist Norway, especially whilst they're growing their own capacity. They have their own aircraft, but they're going to have to grow them. They're going to have to grow their capabilities. They're going to have to grow their production. They're going to have to grow lots of things. They will probably provide a lot of pilots, but I am not diminishing us in any way, I'm fairly sure the British are going to have to supply aircraft at the very least. Probably some fighter pilots, some wings, and probably also radar units. If Norway can set up some version of chain home, that does help on various fronts. It also gives them an air defence network, but also makes things like North Sea control, etc., far more interesting. But I don't want you to think about the convoys as just being a one-way tool. Because whilst I doubt very much that any convoys are being sent to Oslo, they might well be being sent to Trondheim, and definitely to Narvik. Why will convoys be going from the UK to Trondheim? Because my strong suspicion is that supply routes will be established to make sure that you can flow a decent flow of supplies overland from Trondheim to Oslo. And in that area you would build air bases. Why? Well, when you think about it, Oslo to Berlin is 520 miles. London to Berlin, 580 miles. It's not that long a distance. It's not that far. And that's sea fly. However, Oslo to Ploiești, which is, I'm probably mispronouncing, is the heart of Romanian oil fields that Germany depends upon for its World War II war effort, well, that's 1,212 miles, whereas from London it's 1,280 miles. And of course, from London you are flying over occupied France, Belgium, Germany, and all the heartland of Germany. If you look at it, you are flying a very difficult flight route over a lot of defended airspace, a lot of congested airspace. If you fly from Oslo, well, you're straight down Poland. And if you consider the ranges of Vickers Wellington, 1C, 2,550 miles, a Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, 1,650 miles, or a Handley Page Hampton, 1,720 miles at full load, suddenly you realise that with the bombers the British have available in 1939-1940, 1941, you can do a lot more targeting. You can hit a lot more with these aircraft. If you have bases in Norway as well. It's kind of like the story of, well, the alternate history of if you retain control of Crete, you can hit Romania. You can hit the oil fields. If you're doing it from Norway, though, well, the supplies get loaded on in Rosyth and get taken to Trondheim, and that's a fairly easier journey. Fairly easy, but yeah, an easier journey than it is to get the materials round to Crete to support our bomber forces. This is going to have an impact on the war, because not only is Germany losing out on iron ore supplies, on special high quality iron ore supplies, but they'll be losing out on specialist chemicals which they got from Norway and from Sweden for those ports. They do not now have the facilities to operate from Norway, and the advantages that gave them in terms of geographic and location. And now there is far more of their territory which can be readily accessed by the early war bomber fleet of the British. And access areas which you do not want to be hit The Germans are always short of oil. Throughout World War II, they are short of oil. The amount of operations which would have been curtailed and had to be curtailed if you start seriously and heavily hitting the Romanian oil fields on a regular, let alone on a semi-regular, let alone a regular basis, but on a regular, let alone a consistent basis, i.e. almost weekly or something like that, they'd be in tremendous trouble. They really would be. Then we have the North Sea. Short Sunderland. Great aircraft. Lovely aircraft. Almost going to call it a great vessel, but it is actually quite a good boat as well as its flying boat name suggests. That's the primary patrol aircraft the British are building in this period. Now, if you have to patrol the entire Atlantic, that's a huge scope of ocean you have to patrol. But if instead you're patrolling the North Sea, you've got an aerial barrier going across, forcing submarines to have to spend their entire time transcending the North Sea underwater, or as near enough underwater, constantly crash diving, you're going to be tremendously cutting down their ranges. Couple this with maybe some mines, a sort of repeat of the World War I Great North Sea Barrier. Rather, the barrage, as the Americans prefer to call it. And you have some really interesting issues taking place. Finally, you have the fact that with fighters being able to operate, even Spitfires, able to operate from both the UK and Norway, as well as Hurricanes, suddenly those patrolling aircraft will have protection. So convoys going across the North Sea, going across the North Atlantic between northern Britain and Norway, i.e. Trondheim, Narvik, they're going to be not only a long way away from German aircraft attacks, they're going to be the other side of a lot of fighter patrols. They're going to be the other side of a lot of aerial anti-submarine patrols, which means submarines are going to have to be very careful. And remember, the German submarine force in 1939, 1940, into early 1941 is not as great as it will grow to be. Any losses received in this period are going to have a massive ongoing impact because of the loss of institutional memory each crew lost represents. The North Sea would become again a pen, rather like it had been in World War I. But there are differences this time, because with the advantage of Norway, you can then put some motor torpedo boats and other such vessels in Norway, maybe some destroyers. Maybe I'll be happy to have them, after all they're there to help protect them. Those vessels might well start operating consistently off the coast of Denmark, but also pushing further into the Baltic. You'll suddenly have submarines operating from Norway into the Baltic, and suddenly you have the North Sea becoming a very dangerous area for German surface vessels. So Bismarck and Tirpitz, and Scharnhorst, if it's the one that survives, are now going to be faced with a scenario where if they go into the North Sea, the odds are they will get detected by an aircraft. Aircraft which know what they're doing because they'll be out there patrolling for submarine and surface threats. Because that's what they're going to be consistently doing. It's not going to be like the patrols off the Bay of Biscay and didn't realise what they were there for. It's going to be very difficult for them to not realise what they're there for in the North Sea under this scenario. And those aircrafts are going to be able to fly from Britain fully and heavily loaded, land in Norway, refuel, maybe swap crews, and fly back again. It's going to allow them to keep up almost a consistent, constant presence in the air over the North Sea. have a think about what the impact is on British operations of this. Think about it from the point of view of British capital ships. If large German surface raiders now have to break out of the North Sea to be able to get anywhere, do you need to have R's escorting convoys in across the Atlantic on a regular basis? No. You can use those capital ships, those battleships, for other duties. What can they do? Well, do you have a position you want to hold? Do you want to make sure no German surface ships maybe get out of the North Sea? Well, perhaps you put a couple in Norway and a couple in Scotland. And then you only need to have a couple of fast ships ready to surge out either way, especially as the Germans will have lost ships, as said in the earlier Battle of Norway. So that's going to have an impact on their ability to get ships out of here. They're going to have to bring them through the Kiel Canal, because if you try and take them through the Skagerrak, there's going to be British submarines, British torpedo boats, aircraft, Norwegian submarines, Norwegian torpedo boats, and destroyers from both sitting in the Skagerrak. That's not going to be an area you want to go through. If the British are really nasty, there's an R-class sitting up there as well going, hello, we know you can reach me and bomb me, but, you know, I'm less worried about... The Royal Navy doesn't really worry about me losing me too much. They prefer not to lose me because my crew is valuable. I'm a useful thing. But if I'm lost, that's not the same as losing Nelson, Rodney, or any of the more modern, more advanced, refitted ships. But quite simply, that can block the Skagerrak. That can provide... Again, this is the point I would make. You can say Tirpitz, Bismarck, they can beat an R-class in a fight. They can. Can they beat an R-class in a fight when they're also dealing with 24 torpedo boats, half a dozen destroyers, 4 submarines, and they've got no support and no air support? They might still beat the R-class, but they're going to get sunk. And if you have to ask the Royal Navy whether they're happy to exchange an R-class for a bit of a Bismarck or Tirpitz, they'll say not happy, but willing to. Again, this is going to have an effect on the Royal Navy's ability to operate, because you're going to free up those ships for other duties. So they could be here. They could be doing this. They could also be at Gibraltar, being the blocking force to stop the Italians getting out of Mediterranean. They could be en masse deployed to the Far East. You have the entire squadron sitting in the Far East. And remember, you also have HMS Glorious has still arrived, because Glorious didn't get lost. Because Glorious couldn't be lost because Charles and Eisenhower had already been in their battle and been driven off, so it has consequences. And now you have a really interesting problem to get into, because once you start considering the German air operations from Norway and how those affected World War II, the aircraft they operated from, you start looking at Britain, you're going, well, hang on. The Clyde area of Britain, Glasgow, Edinburgh, all these sort of areas up the Scottish coast, they're now well beyond range of German air attacks. Yeah, some of these attacks are made by long-range aircraft flying from Netherlands, flying from, you know, France, etc. But there's also some of them are made from Norway. And if you have now got fighters operating from Norway with radar control, and you've got fighters operating from the UK, then German aircraft are going to have to be very careful about where they operate from and how they operate. And this is going to mean that British industry is going to be less prone to the disruptions. Because if you have one of Britain's major industrial areas go from lighter to much lighter, their attacks, and the same to an extent for the rest, well, that's going to cause Britain to be able to produce even more. It's often forgotten just how many bombs are dropped on Britain and how much they still manage to produce. This is a factor. Norway, it affects this. It affects the likelihood of the Germans being able to do this bombing. As said again, you can be attacking places like Romania with their fuel supplies, which will affect their aviation fuel supplies. You're stopping them getting certain lubricants and oils, which they normally got out of Scandinavia historically. All those things are going to have an effect on German air operations and German ability to operate. So that's going to have a lessening effect to an extent on the air raids accomplished. Combine that with the loss of the geographical proximity to certain areas of the UK, which was afforded by bases in Norway. And it's all going to be cumulative. It's going to be cumulative. And then we're into the North Atlantic. Well, this is interesting. See this dark, more heavily shaded part? That's where German submarines were operating 1939, 1940. Heavily. Now, you can go, well, you know, they still get France. Yes, they do. But the amount of boats which went round the UK to get to France in order to be based from France, which couldn't go round the UK under this scenario. Yes, you can go, well, they can get through the channel. They can get through the channel. They can if they go underwater, but that's still not exactly the best place to go, and the British have ASDIC-equipped motor torpedo boats running up and down the channel, as well as aircraft. Although those are going to have an impact on your vessel, on your submarines going through there. It's going to be the same as the North Sea, in that they're going to have to spend a lot of time underwater, and the longer they have to spend underwater, the greater the chance of something going wrong underwater, but also the more limited their ranges. Consider these submarines. These are some of the most common submarines. Well, the three most common types of submarines and the most common variants of those submarine types. There were 50 Type 2 submarines built. 20 of them were Bs. They had a range of 3,100 nautical miles at 8 knots. On the surface, and they could do roughly, well, 40 nautical miles at 4 knots submerged. Now, once we get to the Ds, well, they can do 5,650 nautical miles at 8 knots surfaced, or 56 nautical miles at 4 knots submerged. The Type 7s, well, both the Cs and the C-41s could do 8,500 nautical miles at 10 knots. And those two classes account for 659 of the 703 the Type 7 submarines produced. They can do 80 nautical miles at 4 knots submerged. Think about how long 4 knots submerged it will take you to get anywhere. And then imagine you're doing 4 knots submerged into a 6 knot current. Imagine where you end up. And then there are the really long range vessels, the Type 9 submarines. The Cs and the C-40s are the variants I've gone with, but they're 194 produced, and I have put in the details for, well, 141 of them. The seas, 13,450 nautical miles at 10 knots surfaced, 63 nautical miles at 4 knots submerged, versus 13,850 nautical miles at 10 knots surfaced for the C-40s, and 63 nautical miles at 4 knots submerged. The point is this: North Atlantic campaign, the North Atlantic gap, and a lot of these things might not happen the way they did historically, because the submarines won't get out there. If Norway is supporting the British, and you have got maritime patrol aircraft going backwards and forwards in and across the North Sea, if you have escort vessels patrolling backwards and forwards in hunter-killer groups, backwards and forwards, you make it necessary for submarines to do a lot of work to even get out to that operating area. And every hour, every day they spend trying to navigate their way through the North Sea to get to where they need to go is time they don't have on patrol. And you have to remember, they then also have to navigate it on the way back. And there's going to be a good chance they get killed, either way, going or coming back. That's going to affect their operations. It's going to affect their capabilities. It's going to be a constant drain on their forces. So that's going to change the North Atlantic campaign. And if the Germans again decide to invade the Soviet Union, well, let's be honest, the Arctic convoys become a completely different scenario, because you no longer have Norway for the Germans to launch attacks from. In fact, Norway is, by that point, is a bastion, is a defensive wall between those convoys and Germany. The Arctic convoys can pretty much run all year round, with pretty much no fear, because there's no surface raiders sitting in Norway, there's no submarines in Norway, there's no aircraft attacking from Norway. They are going away from bases all the way. They're going away from the Germans. Their highest threat positions will be when they leave the UK. That'll be the period they're suffering at the most threat. And if the British decide to start launching them from Iceland or from Greenland or Halifax, then they possibly will never come into German operating radius. And that's the other thing, of course. You don't have to invade Iceland. If Norway hasn't fallen, you don't have to invade Iceland. The British don't need to send forces there. They don't need to expend the political capital for it. They don't need to do that. Now, they might want to secure basing rights from Iceland, especially for aircraft and maritime patrol. They might want to do that, but there are ways to probably get that without actually invading Iceland, kind of like you get the Azores to base from. Because Portugal is a really good ally who finds a really interesting old document. Not because they're worried about Franco next door and thinking that Franco might try to be expansionist, so they decide to batter up the others while still technically remaining neutral. No. It's because they're a good ally. Then we had the Mediterranean. Well, this is where you get the really interesting point, because if Glorious is available, do you need a carrier, another carrier up in the North Sea? Or do you need, when you have air bases on both sides of the North Sea to launch from, or do you need that carrier down in the Mediterranean? It's probably down in the Mediterranean with Eagle. In which case they're joined by Illustrious. In which case Eagle gets maintained, rather than being needed for operations. If you've got 3 carriers and one of them is looking dodgy, instead of taking it with you, you take it in for maintenance. And that means you have 3 carriers for Taranto. Now, if the Italians, the Regia Marina, suffer enough losses at Taranto, and let's be honest, I've done this one when I did an alternate history of Taranto, a video about Taranto, and I did some alternate history discussions at the end. You have 3 carriers there. You have the air group of Glorious, Illustrious, and Eagle involved in that attack. Lord help the Italian Navy. the loss rate for the Regia Marina goes sky high. Instead of Taranto being a huge strategic boost to the British, in terms of ego, in terms of showing capabilities and reach, and a problem for the Italians in terms of showing their weakness in their principal harbour, but it didn't knock the Italian fleet out of the war. Please note it didn't do that. It did knock out quite a lot of their battleships for quite a while, but not the Italian fleet out for the war, no. But what it would, with those 3 carriers involved, you could be talking about Giulio Cesare being the only surviving capital ship that functions for the Regia Marina. As I said before, to actually kill that vessel, when you look at it in the harbour, you suddenly realise to do a torpedo bomber attack on it, it's pretty much impossible. You're going to hit something else. If you've got enough you haven't got the right aircraft, you'd have enough bombers. You need skewers with you to actually be able to bomb it. Now, while I'm thinking about it, let's get back to discuss the Battle of Britain, because I skipped over that a bit when I talk about war in the UK. Because, again, you have a sort of a reorientation of the German threat, and you have the offensive capabilities, and how that's going to affect German operations. But more importantly, when you consider British fighters deploying from Norway and deploying from Britain, etc., and the ability to intercept German strikes, it's all going to add up. Your long-range fighter aircraft, especially your Mosquito fighter aircraft and those things which appear later in the war and to use at various points, they suddenly become very useful because they can do long-range patrols across the North Sea happily, being a blocking scenario which could well stop Britain actually being attacked further up its coast, because the Germans could be dealing with air interception a long way before they actually get to Britain. And as we all know, with enemy air attacks and with aircraft attacks, if you consider in this period, the big thing was to break up enemy air attacks, because the more you break up an enemy air attack, the more likely they are to get lost, the more likely they are to run into trouble, the more likely they are to just give up and go home, drop their bombs in the ocean and go off home. So, if you can operate from Norway and you can be doing that kind of patrol, that will make your life a lot easier. Britain is still going to get bombed. Please note that. I'm not saying it's not. And it's still going to have a tough Battle of Britain. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Battle of Britain is more concentrated in its focus, which will actually make it easier in a way for Fighter Command to be able to rotate in air groups, rotate in wings, and rotate out wings for recuperation and rebuilding throughout the battle. So, the Mediterranean, glorious around makes a big difference. It does. But there's also now the factor that if you do that at Taranto, then the support for the operations against Crete, even to an extent some of the invasions of some of the movements against Greece, goes away from the Italian perspective. The Italian Navy, if they are sufficiently damaged at Taranto, changes Greece. And the whole scenario changes the moment you add in that extra carrier. Because you add in one more carrier into the Mediterranean fleet. Before Illustrious arrives, you add in that extra carrier. Suddenly, Eagle is not so essential, so she might get maintenance anyway. But the moment Illustrious turns up, you send Eagle in for maintenance. You go, right, you've been bombed. You've been damaged. We think everything's okay, but we can take the time to check, because we've got 2 carriers now. We don't need to worry about it so much. We've got 2 carriers available. You can go be maintained, and then we'll have 3 carriers all fully worked up. And it builds up. Because if you have those carriers available and then you don't have Crete, because the Italian battle fleet isn't available to cover the movement of their amphibious forces to Crete, then you most likely don't have to do the evacuation of Crete, which means you don't have the ships damaged in that. And this is going to have ongoing consequences. There are going to be ongoing consequences. If your German submarines are getting through to the Bay of Biscay to operate from France, yes, you can go, well, perhaps they start breaking them up and bring them by train. They could do that. They could start bringing them up by train across to France and then reassembling them in French yards. But in the nicest way, French yards, even when they're supplying France, are not always the most reliable in reducing things to a standard. And if they really don't like you, goodness knows what they'll do to your submarines. Do you really want to go to sea in a submarine that's been reassembled by the French, who you're occupying? This is going to have an impact on Germany's ability to get submarines into the Mediterranean. This is going to have an ability or an impact on their ability to actually link up with forces, and this is going to impact their ability to deploy to North Africa. Again, if the Royal Navy are strong enough, because they're able to focus their forces enough, and they do focus quite a lot on the Mediterranean in World War II, if they don't need as many forces, if they can leave some of their coverage work to the R-class, and they can afford to just have a couple of fast battleships covering the North Sea, then Renown, Repulse and Hood could probably get their refits done. But who knows what else could happen in order to boost the British capabilities? Because the British have less stresses, because the enemy threat is more condensed. So you've not got to be so strong in so many different places. So, the Mediterranean, therefore, is interesting, which leads us to North Africa. Now, North Africa, traditionally, it goes backwards and forwards depending on how close you are to the supply lines and whether or not you can get supplies. If you're close to your supply lines, you can move up. If you're far from your supply lines, your logistics will be cut by the enemy and you'll be withdrawing. Well, the thing is, the British depend a lot on maritime supplies, as do the Italians and the North Africa Corps. If the Italian Navy has been sufficiently damaged in Taranto, that all the British need to do to threaten their convoys is move capital ships forward along the coast, they can do that. They can keep this side, they can keep in the southern shore of the Mediterranean. They can stay on it. As far away from Italian air power and any air power the Luftwaffe brings in as possible, or close to supporting Allied air power as possible, with carriers helping protect them. They can do it. And they can intervene between supply runs of the Axis forces. And those can be timed and coordinated to wear down Axis supplies so that when the ground forces launch their strike, the Axis forces don't have the necessary fuel to maneuver. And remember again, if Romania is being attacked, they're going to be really short. North Africa is always an interesting campaign because in many ways it should be a stomp for both sides at different points because of supposed advantages, but it never is because of logistics. Until logistics turns so heavily in favour of one side, and that's when you see this happen. The entire campaigns of 1942. Well, if Norway hasn't fallen, if Glorious has not been sunk, if Britain is able to attack the Romanian oil fields, this might come a lot sooner, because A, the flows will be lower of fuel coming to North Africa in the first place, which means those targets are going to be, you're able to, there's fewer targets for you to have to intercept, but you know what's important, you can take it out. And the submarines operating from Malta will be taking it out. But also, the British will have that much more freedom of manoeuvre because of their capabilities they have available. If Crete doesn't fall, that can be set up as another bomber place to attack Romania and attack various other sites in southern Europe. That could be a threat to could be producing material for war. It can also be equipped with fighters and supplies, and those fighters and supplies can be an unsinkable aircraft carrier for World War II. That means that the Mediterranean fleet operating on the coast, especially on the southern coast, has defence in depth. Especially once you add in Malta. And you can now get supplies going all along this coast and then jumping out to Malta, protected the entire way. And if North Africa happens, well, then you have an interesting scenario in December 1941. Because if the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor in December 1941 under this scenario, Germany is hemmed in. Germany is lacking resources. They will have probably lost in North Africa. They might still have control of France, but they're probably fighting a very vicious, fifth column war. They are more than likely dealing with British bombing raids on critical parts of their infrastructure industry. And if they've also gone toward the Soviet Union, then they are really in trouble. Now, you could argue they are more likely to go with the Soviet Union if they think that, frankly, they've not got enough oil, so they're going to go hunt it down. They could, alternatively, be buying their oil from the Soviet Union and decide that, frankly, it's not sensible to attack them and go to war with them. Either way, if Japan, when Japan carries out Pearl Harbor, because they get into that particular train of thought, which means that's the only option they can foresee, well, then they're going to be in trouble. Because if they join them to declare war on America, they're fighting a very different Britain. They're fighting a very different America. There's no fighting left to be done in North Africa. Germany will be contained. And Italy probably contained as well. In fact, let's be honest, if Il Duce has lost North Africa and the British have also destroyed his fleet, then the odds of Il Duce still being in charge in Italy are very low, which might mean Italy has swapped sides or are neutral. It's something to think through. I don't think myself Il Duce survives the loss of North Africa. I'm not sure if he survives the severe damage of his fleet that free carriers would inflict at Taranto. But the free carrier attack and the damage that would have inflicted at Taranto could well have led to the Americans taking more notice of it and being less secure in Pearl Harbor and feeling less secure there, which might mean they don't have all their battleships quite so neatly there. But the odds are they think it's something that happened to the Italians and wouldn't happen to them, like they did historically. The real interesting thing will be the difference in Force Z, because, let's be honest, if Britain has had a carrier, a carrier survived longer. Glorious definitely survived Norway. Don't know what happened to her much after that, but as I said, I think she's in the Mediterranean. If you haven't lost the carriers damaged, you did historically, because Crete, etc. hasn't happened, and because you've been able to do other things, and you've been building up your carrier numbers, I doubt Force Z deploys to the Far East without an extra fast capital ship with it, if not more. If not more, it could be two Duke of York class, no, two King George V class, i.e. Duke of York and Prince of Wales. It could be also Renown and Repulse deployed. It could even be Hood, Renown, Repulse, and two King George V's. That could be the force deployed, and I don't see them being deployed with anything less than a couple of carriers, at which point you suddenly have a very major force sitting in Singapore. A very major force, with destroyers and all the other systems around it to protect it. That can be deployed, because let's be honest, where do you need those capital ships? Do you need a huge fleet to watch Germany's Bismarck, Tirpitz, Scharnhorst? Perhaps, if one of them's available, come out North Sea. You probably do need some of them, but not that many. You probably are looking at, for the Royal Navy, they're probably going to be trying to maintain Anson, Howe, King George V there, at least 3 of the KGVs, and probably, if you do not have, this is the point, if you do not have to worry about Italy having more than the Giglio Cesare, do you need to have Warspite, Valiant, and Queen Elizabeth in the Mediterranean? The free, modernised Queen Elizabeth class? Probably not. You probably have them backing up the free King George V's. Those 6 ships, they're more than enough to hold the North Sea. That's what the Queen Elizabeth class were arguably built for. Especially if they're backed up by some R-class. Which means, with Warspite, Valiant, and Queen Elizabeth there, Barham and Malaya are probably the core of the Mediterranean fleet, with maybe an R-class backing them up. The other R-class could well be in the Indian Ocean as escorts for convoys, or they could be backing up the North Sea blockade scenario, or they could be backing up the Mediterranean. It could well be a scenario where you have one sitting in Scotland, one sitting in Norway, one sitting in probably Gibraltar, just in case Giglio Cesare comes that way, and one sitting in the Indian Ocean helping out with convoys there, in case the surface raider shows up. And that's going to change things. Where do you have the carriers? Well, you probably have one with the Mediterranean fleet, because again, do you need to have more under the scenario where the Italians only have one battleship and are restricted to the northern side of the southern side of the Mediterranean has been taken and is all yours, so you can have air bases? You probably have another one sitting in with the home fleet with those fast capital ships. Do you need Force H to have a carrier? Does Force H even exist at this point? That's a question. That is a question worth asking. So, you could have more than 2 carriers with Force E. You could have 3 carriers. 4 carriers even. Suddenly it becomes a very major force. Not quite the equivalent of the American Pacific Fleet, but it's a significant enough force that the Japanese are going to have to really think about it. And yes, they can deploy their force to go and attack Pearl Harbor. They can do this in the summer of 1941, but they can't send the same forces south to attack Malaya as they did historically. Because 4 carriers and 5 capital ships, that's a force which will cause severe trouble for them. They haven't got anything they're sending south that can fight that lot. 2 carriers and 5 capital ships. 2 carriers and 4 capital ships. Doesn't matter. The moment you've got the carrier capital ship combination in multiples, you have got something which, for the Japanese to fight, they're going to have to deploy a massive amount of force. which means they're going to have to wait till the Kido Butai has returned. They're going to have to rearm, repair, refit the Kido Butai, and then deploy, which is going to take time. And if the American forces combine up with the British forces, that can mean there is a whole new battle taking place in the South China Sea or the South, somewhere around the Philippines, between an Anglo-American task force, an Anglo-American fleet, and the Japanese fleet. And that could be a very interesting battle, especially if, as historically is the case, the Americans go, right then, you take over the air defense, we'll lead some of the strike, and the British probably go, yes, you can run the daytime strikes with your massive air strikes, but what we'll do is we'll keep up the constant night strikes which we've trained on. I don't see the Italians, I don't see the Japanese fleet surviving that. The Japanese fleet are not equipped to deal with night air attacks. They really aren't. They have very limited means of engagement. So you have that going on. Who knows what happens with the rest of World War II? So summary and question, because it's always good to ask a question at this point. And it's always good to think of other questions to ask at this point. This is an alternate history where we change things around in terms of Norway. And it has a cumulative impact. That's the thing, it's a cumulative impact. Everything builds upon everything else, as is the same always in these wars. The moment a war goes on, when you're talking about very short wars, you can talk about the initial capabilities of countries. But when you're talking about a longer conflict, the longer a war goes on, the more and more it becomes a cumulative impact. Small wins, small losses start to have an impact far beyond what their initial result was. And so today's question is three things. One, I'd like you to think about where you think that battle I was discussing at the end would take place, i.e. the Anglo-American fleet battle against the Japanese. I also like to think about who might be in charge of that. My bet is if you're deploying a carrier battleship task force, and you're deploying it and you don't need Force H, I think it's probably Somerville. It could be Cunningham even. But I think it's probably Somerville. I think you have two very good admirals at the front of the pack at this period. And I don't think the Royal Navy would not deploy one of them to command such a major force. Tom Phillips is deployed because he's commanding two capital ships and he's considered a reliable pair of hands. Safe pair of hands to send him. I think, and as said, I've got into the Singapore stuff and the scenarios that happened and some of the miscommunications that happened and misunderstandings that happened led to what happened there in other videos. But yeah, he wasn't a bad admiral. But here's the question, if you have the British there and they have 4 carriers and 5 capital ships and they're supplying these forces, the odds are the British are not going to accept the scenario of, well, yeah, we want to be, it's an American-led combined fleet. It's not going to be. If the Americans are showing up with 2 carriers, which is probably what the most they could get there at the time, to meet up with such a force, if the Japanese have had to delay their attack till they can, and they're sort of combining up, it's probably going to have to be an American deputy commander with a British commander. That's probably the structure you're going to be, because think about it. 5 capital ships, fast capital ships, and 4 carriers as the base of the British force deployed there to deter the Japanese. That's a major fleet deployment. That's a major capability. It's going to be a senior officer the Royal Navy are going to deploy, a full admiral at least. Who do the Americans have there? How does it go? Where does the fight happen? I'd love to hear your views on that. Secondly, of course, the question is always the same: is how do you think I did? Were you sort of following what I was saying? Have I missed bits? Have I jumped over bits? It's trying to roughly get it to roughly 1.5 hours, 90 minutes. That's always fun. Especially when you have managed to bite your tongue enough times that you have 3 ulcers on your tongue. So I apologise if I've been drinking more milk than I normally do. I managed to bite my tongue quite badly this morning and it's hurting now. And, well, another interesting perspective, another question to put is this. In this scenario, we're talking about if Norway didn't fall. And that's a useful scenario. I also think it has a big impact for Finland, etc. Their involvement in World War II and all sorts of things beyond that. But there is another country which is almost just as interesting in terms of impact. And that's if Italy doesn't join World War II. If Mussolini decides to go neutral. Decides to do the same as Franco, stay neutral. I'd love to hear your opinion of what you think would happen then. I sometimes wonder if Mussolini had decided to go neutral, whether Hitler might have tried to invade Italy. But we'll leave that to once, instead of the Soviet Union. But I doubt he would have done. Because there's not really any Lebensraum or anything useful in Italy. But there again, his Italian ally has deserted him. He could feel really, really annoyed. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. What have we got coming up? Next week, we have battleships and battle cruisers that might have been. A sort of discussion of the tech involved and the ships involved. It's kind of interesting because it's going to filter into a lot of key ships discussions we've had over the last few months, and I think it should be interesting. And next week's live is battleships and battle cruisers are separate categories in the Washington Naval Treaty. That's going to be fun. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for your help. Thank you very much for your liking and supporting the channel. Nothing I do would actually be possible without it. Really wouldn't be possible without it. Some of you will have heard I'm having fun with the old universities at the moment. Life happens. And thank you for making it possible for me to be a historian and me to carry on with my work. Take care and have a nice evening.